Do you want to bust your sales quota? Do you want to join the ranks of top 1% sellers? The Top 1% Sellers podcast gives you the insights and the tools to help you achieve your sales greatness. The podcast features sales and services professionals, leaders, and experts to give you the edge you're looking for. Here's your host, Ash Sadiq.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started, and then we'll do the official start once we are inside the broadcast.
Okay, so you'll introduce me or what?
Yes, definitely, yes. And we'll do it really, we'll do a give and take. I mean, basically, I'll ask you questions, and then, you know, how many are the charts and the slides?
Well, if I did it without interruption, it's a solid 45 minutes.
Okay, perfect.
But I mean, feel free to do it, but it's, you know, sort of designed as a one-man show. I don't mind being interrupted.
Fantastic. No, that's fine, because I think the first one with Tim, we did it very much like what you just described. And I think what we can do is let you run through it, and then I can ask a couple of questions at the end.
Sure.
Fantastic. Hello and welcome everyone. This is the Top 1% Sellers Academy webinar, and today's webinar is with Lewis Schiff. And I'll just take a few minutes here to give you a quick introduction of Lewis's work. He is the author of the new book, First Habit, and his other books include Business Brilliant, Surprising Lessons from the Greatest Self-Made Business Icons. He's also the executive director of Inc. Business Owners Council, a membership organization for Inc. magazine's top entrepreneurs and owners of closely held family businesses. He also maintains a blog about behavioral entrepreneurship on Inc.com. Lewis has also co-authored The Influence of Affluence, How the Rich Are Changing America, and the Armchair Millionaire. The reason why I invited Lewis to come talk to our sales audience is because a lot of the content that he has covered in his books is really about mastering your own life and mastering your own skills and really succeeding. And I'd like to take a lot of the conversation we'll do today and really angle it to how do you succeed in your own job, and also how do you create wealth for your family as well. So with that, I'll give the floor to Lewis on the back end. We'll ask some questions, and hopefully you can also give us some questions in the Q&A window as well. We'll be taking a look at those. And with that, Lewis, it's your floor now.
Thank you, Ash. Thanks for that introduction. Yeah, everything you said, we're going to go through some very powerful stuff. I feel very confident in saying that I expect everyone who's listening to this today to be at the very least provoked into thinking. And for some of you, there's some potentially life-changing information ahead. And for me, it's always very exciting to play the role of messenger for that kind of thing. But first, I'll just introduce myself. I've written, as Ash mentioned, a bunch of books. Some of them bestsellers. It's been a privilege to write books. I think of all the things I've done, starting and buying and selling companies, the thing that's meant the most to me over the years has been interviewing very, very successful people. In fact, it's my passion, and it's what I love to do most. And for any of you who have wondered what it would be like to sit down with some of the greatest entrepreneurs of all time, I can tell you it's a thrill, and it's just been the greatest privilege of all my activities. So now, for the next bit of time here that we're together, I want you to remember that since this is about rewiring your brain, guess what? Your brain's going to be involved. So you're going to have to be prepared to think and activate that thing in between your ears. And I've asked Ash to share a little cheat sheet, which he's going to post up a link to. Whether you can download it now or you want to look at it later, it's a little bit of a cheat sheet that's going to allow you to follow along with what we're doing. But again, more than once, I'm going to remind you that you have to think while we rewire your brain. So I'll give you clear warning at those moments. So just a little bit about, not so much me, but about the platform I've built or the position I've created. Back in 1996, I wrote my first book called The Armchair Millionaire, which was about a way to invest your money in a way that would create wealth in a very thoughtful way. In fact, it's since gone on to, the methodology has since gone on to be awarded more than one Nobel Prize, and that's been exciting to watch. And that book was about something called behavioral economics. And behavioral economics is super simple. It's really just all the different ways that the way our brains are wired affect how we approach the ways we make money in the stock market or in savings. Even things like how we approach coupons in the supermarket all fall under the category of behavioral economics. And then about 10 years later, I wrote this book called Business Brilliant, which evolved the topic of behavioral economics into something called behavioral entrepreneurship. How decision-making affects not just money-making in general, but business building, how our pre-wired attitudes affect the way we build businesses. And out of that book came 7 best practices for how the truly business brilliant, those who are brilliant at business, succeed by exemplifying these behaviors that most likely lead to wealth. Now, this is even more true in the new economy that we're in, post-2008. And it's only accelerated since then, but I did the research for this book in 2009. And the thing I learned in writing Business Brilliant was that even though these 7 best practices, which you could read about in the book, it's too long for me to go into today, are there for you, and you'll recognize probably every single one of them. They're all accessible. They're all within reach. Here's the thing. When it comes to this topic of behavioral entrepreneurship, we've got some challenges ahead. And those challenges look a lot like our parents and our families, our teachers and our schools, and our bosses and our employers. Now, all of these people often wish us the best intentions, but they are teaching us a way of going about our careers and developing them that's built on a time that no longer exists and in an economy that no longer exists. And so what the point of Business Brilliant is that it's going to confront you. It's going to ask you to look at the way that you've created wealth or attempted to create wealth. It's going to ask you to do something that's very uncomfortable, which is reevaluate the way you do that. And so if you see on your screen now, you have the image of a steering wheel, and it's called cognitive dissonance, what I'm going to share with you. And let me give you an example that we can all understand. Everyone who's listening to this right now knows that the smartest and safest way to drive a car is to keep 2 hands on the wheel, drive the speed limit, wear your seatbelt, and check your mirrors often. And the statistics behind safe driving back that up, that in fact, that is the smartest way to drive your car. That's a wonderful moment where the conventional wisdom and the data back each other up. But what if I shared with you that over a period of time, the data suggested that driving with one hand, with only one hand on the steering wheel above the speed limit, without wearing your seatbelt and without checking your mirrors, statistically proved to be the safest way to reach your destination? Would you change the way you drive? And more importantly, would you teach your children to drive that way? That's cognitive dissonance, when the data and the beliefs collide, and it's ugly. It just doesn't feel right. And so what I'm going to share with you now is a comparison. I'm going to use numbers, so I'm going to back everything I say to you up with data. I'm going to use numbers to show that what's keeping you from creating wealth is not your abilities, and it's not someone else. It's your capacity to think differently and to overcome the cognitive dissonance that this brings up. How does that sound, Ash?
Sounds really good. And it's really in line with the top 1% sellers factory philosophy that we found that it's really very dependent on the mindset. So I think we're very much in line, Lewis.
Great. Now there's this cheat sheet that Ash put up a link to. So again, you're going to be able to run through this without it, but there it is for you, maybe for later for some of you. So just a quick background on the data that makes up my book, Business Brilliant. So I surveyed 800 households, and I'll just quickly tell you about the 4 groups that we surveyed. You'll recognize all of them. The first I call the middle class, and this is a group that had a net worth of less than $1 million. And they made up about half, 49% of the people I surveyed for this book. Then I asked the exact same questions of a group that I called the middle class millionaire. These are people who started out life in the middle class and went on to create levels of wealth ranging from $1 million to $10 million. They made up 28% of my survey. And we all know people like this if you're not one yourself. And the most common group that I speak to are, in fact, middle class millionaires. I think you'll see throughout this that even middle class millionaires with all that great success of having reached a 7-figure net worth are actually behaving in a way that's preventing them from reaching an 8-figure net worth. But that's my next group, is those who break into 8 figures of net worth. I call the first group the high net worth. They make up 14% of my survey respondents with a $10 to $30 million net worth. And then I've got folks that are just living the dream. You know, they're the billionaires and the 100 millionaires. And I surveyed 73 of them, 9%. It's a very hard number to get to. And I'm really proud of the fact that I got that high. Those folks don't love to sit and share their ideas with guys like me. But the thing about the last 3 groups, the middle class millionaire, the high net worth, and the ultra high net worth, every one of these people I surveyed could not have received more than $50,000 from their families, including the cost of their education, in order to make it into my survey. So that's about as clear of a definition of self-made millionaires you're ever going to find. And they made up over 50% of my survey respondents, people who met that criteria. So let's take a look at what I learned from these 800 households. Right. The central message of my program today is that they taught me 3 behaviors that explain their success and that work synergistically, meaning each one of these adds to the other and then adds to the other. And so I will share with you 1, 2, and 3, but never forget that 1 affects 2, 2 affects 3, 3 affects 1, 1 affects 3, 3 affects 2. They affect each other synergistically. Yeah. So you can have a positive impact by doing any one of them, but the real explosive power of these 3 habits is doing all 3 of them at the same time. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah.
So we're going to talk about learning your language, practicing persistence, and upgrading your network. I'll explain all of them with data. I will not ask you to believe me. I'll ask you to believe what the data tells us. I'm also going to share with you something I think is pretty cool, which is the role of luck and magic in creating success. You know, luck and magic is real, and luck and magic is there for us to touch, and let's just call it what it is. There's a reason why some people are lucky, and there's a certain magic to creating success. And I'm going to share with you, I'm going to break down for you why luck finds some of us more than others and how you can invite magic into your life. And I'll do that during the course of this.
Yes.
But let's start with habit number 1, learn your language. So I had a great opportunity to interview Howard Schultz, the Starbucks CEO, took it from 4 companies to over 10,000. And I'm sorry, 4 stores to over 10,000. Yes. And he shared with me what is his language, which is his love of the role of coffee historically. In other words, he will tell you, and his smile will go ear to ear when he tells you, that at all the critical junctures in history, people have sat down over coffee. They've sat down over coffee to fall in love, to make new friends, to do deals, to create peace treaties. He loves how coffee is always in the center of that, and he believes that by being the best supply chain manager and getting coffee to you, he's creating connections between people. And he famously envisioned Starbucks as what he calls the 3rd place. You've got your home, you've got your office, and now you've got the 3rd place, Starbucks, to meet people. And everything he's done, from creating supply chains to building a retail system to training hundreds of thousands of employees to building a brand, has stemmed from his one true passion, which is to make coffee available to create connections between people. And everything he's learned along the way is built on that. And so what I share in that book you mentioned, Ash, The First Habit, is that you're probably exceptional at something yourself, just like Howard is, but you may not even realize it. And what that means is a lot of us are good at something, but it comes naturally to us, so we don't make that big a deal out of it, or we don't think it's such a big deal. In fact, the thing that you can build your business life around may very well be around that one exceptional thing that you don't think, in fact, you don't even think much of it. And to talk about sales for a moment, in this book, which I think you're going to share a chapter of this book. I don't want to blow that story, but I think you're going to share some of it. In this book, there's an exercise in the segment Ash will share that tells you how you can figure out what you're exceptional at. And I've done this with thousands of people over the years. And what's really amazing are that there's plenty of people who I would put into the category of sales who find out from this process that they are trustworthy, that people like to do business with them, people like to interact with them. And that is in fact the very foundation for sales, that you can persuade somebody because you can build rapport. And many, many times people will find out that they are essentially seen as trusting and persuasive individuals through this journey, through this exercise, and they'll reject it. And they'll reject it because it comes so naturally to them that they think everyone's good at it.
Yeah. They take it for granted.
They take it for granted. And in fact, it's an exceptional skill. And it's obviously a very profitable one if you put all the pieces around it like Howard Schultz did. So just keep that in mind. And so as we talk about learning your language, what I do with workshops, I'm going to shorten it for today, but you can do it later, is I ask this very simple question to the audience, which is, do you know what you're exceptionally good at that makes you money? And I'm going to tear this sentence apart a bit. Exceptionally good at means you're better at than most people around you. And makes you money, makes your company money. It can be either one. And it's a simple question, but you'll be very surprised by what the data showed me when I asked those 800 households about this. First, this is a moment where you could take that paper, that PDF that Ash shared, or just an ordinary piece of paper and pen, and you could write down your answer to this. You could take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, and you could write down what it is you're exceptionally good at, really better at than most people around you, that makes you money. And as I said, Ash is going to share kind of directions on how you can do this using that book, The First Habit, that excerpt. But when I asked those 800 households, the first question is, do you know? Can you answer this question? And I got this interesting set of data back, which is that of my middle class survey respondents, just over half were even connected to this question. Okay, they could think about it and they could answer in the affirmative, yes, I do know. And you can obviously tell that as levels of wealth go up, so does the likelihood that they have an easy connection to this question. And as you get to 97% for the ultra high net worth, it becomes very clear. In fact, they think about it all the time. It's right there at their fingertips. Almost every one of them said, I know what I'm exceptional at. And you can just ask yourself right now, do you know what you're exceptional at? That has to do with how you make money. Because for gosh sakes, if you don't know what you're exceptional at, that has to do with how you make money, how do you expect to make money? It's absolutely blindingly simple in that when I put it that way. And when I asked them to spend a few minutes writing down all the things they think that they're exceptional at, I got a very surprising response from my 800 households, which is that of the 55% of middle class people who said they knew, they wrote down on average 6 things. And you can plainly see that as the net worth of the people I surveyed goes up, the number of skills that they think they're exceptional at goes down.
So
now, say again?
They get selective and focus more on the ones that are really strength areas for them. You
said the key word, Ash, and this is the simplest thing in the world, focus. Focus leads to wealth. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of things that stop us from doing these things. So if you're reading this and you're saying, okay, this guy is telling me to focus, that's one thing. Let me tell you what's been stopping you, okay? What's been stopping you is this. When I asked them to answer this question, are you working to get better at tasks you're not exceptionally good at? Here's what they told me. The middle class, who's already claiming to be good at 6 things to do with that have to do with how money is made, are also telling me, about 58% of them, that they're also spending their time trying to get good at everything else. And by the time you got to my ultra high net worth survey respondents, none of them said that they were spending any time getting good at anything else. Why is this so important? Because it's not enough to focus. It's also important to specialize and to avoid becoming a generalist.
Absolutely.
Where did we learn? Where in our life did we learn that generalists are good and specialists are bad? I'll tell you where we learned it. When you did a performance review with your boss in the last year, it wouldn't surprise me if he or she said, you know, it seems like you're weak at this. You should work harder to get good at that. And in that very simple and in fact very kind bit of advice, they were making us generalists instead of specialists. They were taking us away from being focused. They were saying, can you become good at the things I expect the person in this job to be good at? Instead of saying, what is it you're really good at in this job? Let's try to clear the decks of everything else and let you do that as much as possible. Because that's what successful people do.
Exactly.
They clear the decks of everything that they can so they can spend as much time doing the thing they're good at. And when our bosses are telling us to become stronger at the things we're weaker at, they're telling us to be more mediocre than we are today.
Yeah, that's a very, very critical point, Lewis, you're making, because when we advertised this webinar, we basically told sales professionals that they will be able to take their careers and their sales activities by the horns. And that's really the crux of the matter that you're covering now, because I can see them doing this almost every quarter, where they basically sit down and get an inventory of what they are doing and what the team members on the account team are doing, and then really get everybody to focus on what they do so well, so that that account manager is not trying to be the administrative team member on the team, is not trying to manage, the systems engineers, is not trying to manage this, that. He's really focusing on the one thing he does or she does really well, and then being able to really partner up across the account team and across the organization so that he leverages everybody's strength area and focus area and drive that account win rate higher, cycle time down, wallet share up, and be able to then at the very end of the day really drive more wealth for everybody involved.
And that's the practice that billionaires do, people with hundreds of millions of dollars do, people with tens of millions of dollars do. And as you could even see, middle-class millionaires are doing it too. They're not doing it as much as the people with high net worths, but they're doing it. Now, I also like to remind everyone that the practice of having your boss tell you to work on your weaknesses actually has a precedent in your own childhood, because we all know that we would come home from school with a good grade in, let's say, math and a bad grade in history, and our teachers and our parents would say, do you need some help with history? When they could have said, hey, seems like you're good at math. Why don't we focus on math?
That's right.
They have been doing this to us for a long time. And it's a time for us to grab back the control of our own agenda and focus, because again, here's the data presented to you right in your face that focusing, in fact, leads to better outcomes.
Yes.
So that's what learning your language is. Simply put, figure out what you're good at and do more of it and less of everything else. And as simple as that sounds, remember what I shared with you about driving a car differently. As simple as it sounds, it's hard to do, partly because there's a lot of forces arrayed, our bosses and our educations, that sort of say, no, we're supposed to spread ourselves out and become good at a lot of things.
And for a lot of people, they think of these people, these are the elders that have the wisdom that we should follow. And it's so, contrarian, unconventional wisdom to really do what you're saying. But that's really where the success is. Exactly.
And so now let me move on to habit 2, which is the hardest of all. If you thought learning your language was hard, and I hope you didn't, because it's very straightforward.
Yes.
Practice persistence is where you have to show a little character and backbone. And to give you an example of character and backbone, I interviewed Hank Paulson, who you probably remember during the horrible time of 2007 and moving into 2008, when the economy was in free fall, and he was our Treasury Secretary. And when I interviewed him, we talked a lot about leadership. And he talked about flexibility in leadership. When in that punishing position he was in, and also as the CEO who took Goldman Sachs public, he learned that his leadership role was to make changes as soon as he saw something wasn't working. To not be beholden to an old idea, even if it was his idea. If it's getting evidence that it's not working, have the flexibility and have the composure to change your path. And so that's what his form of leadership was. And what I'd like to ask those of you, again, this is something you could do on your own, is think about a handful of times when something you put into place wasn't working and what you had to do to pivot, or did you pivot? A lot of us find out things aren't working because we get fired or we get taken off the job. But in fact, this flexible notion of leadership is to see when things aren't working and then make changes as early as you possibly can. So write down the times on a piece of paper at another time where you've had the big failures that have shaped your life that kind of crashed and burned, so we can be acquainted with them, because we want to make sure that we understand that failure is actually a learning tool. It's not something to be avoided.
Yes.
So take a look at some of the data here. I asked the 800 household survey respondents, what did you do after a significant career setback? And here's the answers I got, and they were very shocking to me. So first, the middle class, I was really surprised to hear that more than half of them, when they experienced something like a career setback, thought that that was a message from above that they should be giving up at this point. Wow. That somehow they shouldn't have tried to begin with. They stuck their neck out of the sand, and they got it chopped off. Very destructive force, and you can easily see how our high net worth and ultra high net worth do not subscribe to this, and our middle class millionaires don't either. So imagine this entire middle class who has this attitude that when they fail, they should give up, and you've got an entire set of very successful people who say that failure is in fact an opportunity to try again in the same field. A totally different answer to the same experience.
That's just
and very important moment to ask ourselves, what are we doing? What kind of teams are we building? What kind of children are we raising if we think this is the attitude that pervades? And so I asked similar questions, but I asked them slightly differently. I asked them, have failures taught you what you're good at? And again, the middle class don't seem to understand how failure teaches you to be better, because 17% of them do not connect failure to teaching them what they're good at. And here you can see, as levels of wealth go up, you can see that failure is the learning tool. What I often say is, failure is the mentor you've been waiting for. And as we move to the next question, I asked, have you had career moves that have failed? And from 83 to 99%, everyone I surveyed, and I'm sure everyone listening to this today, we've all had career moves that have failed. Mm-hmm. Of course. And then I asked, do you have associates who've had failures? And this is where I got something that you rarely see in social sciences, which is a kind of a rift in the data that can be explained simply, but is still very troubling. How is it possible that for my middle class survey respondents, 83% of them have experienced failure, but only 19% of them can name somebody in their community who has experienced failure? That doesn't really make sense. It's a difference of 64 percentage points. And notice how as levels of wealth go up, the difference between this number goes down. By the time you get to the very wealthy, the ultra high net worth, 85% of them can name someone who has failed. And what does that tell us? It tells us that amongst the middle class, when they fail, they keep it a secret.
I see.
They don't tell each other that they failed. What's so destructive about that is it's very hard to learn from one another when everyone's keeping it a secret.
So on the other end of the scale, it's actually a badge of honor to actually have failed, right?
That's exactly what that continuum suggests. And in fact, it's this one word. Oh, something happened. It's this one word of shame.
Got it.
For a second. Sorry about this.
Yes.
But shame. Oh, I think that there's a little mistake in my slides here.
Yes.
So shame is basically the operating force where in those communities, they're keeping it to themselves and they're not learning rapidly enough. And then as you move up in levels of wealth where they do actively share it, because they have a totally different attitude about wealth, and I'm sorry, about failure, then they share it. And, if you want to talk about, I have some data, some macro demographic data that talks about how wealthy people, self-made wealthy people, tend to move out of the neighborhoods that they started out in, and they move to wealthy neighborhoods. And this is almost always viewed by the middle class as some kind of an abandonment. That now they've got money, they're moving out of town. And I can tell you that, the houses are bigger and maybe there's a few more gates, but I can tell you that when you interview them, they tell you they need to be around people who look at the world the way they do.
Exactly.
Because the communities that they came from, these middle-class communities, and this is a very good example of it, when they view failure as such a shameful act, it's very hard for these other folks who are clearly demonstrating that failure is a learning tool, not a shameful act.
Exactly.
It's very hard for them to hang around with people who see it so differently.
Exactly.
When they find themselves in those beautiful gated communities where we just stick our noses up against the gates and wonder what life is like in there, I'll tell you what life is like in there. They're talking about their failures. They're talking about their life experiences openly and very honestly. That's what's amazing about it.
Absolutely. And I know that elsewhere you talk about the social contagion, that it's always the company you keep. And I think it does make a difference that if you are in the company of people who take risks, fail often, and pursue success, highly likely you'll be with such a crowd as well.
You've given me a perfect segue, Ash. Upgrade your network. So if you're doing a better job of learning your language, if you're doing a better job of both identifying and then focusing on what you do best, you're likely doing that because you're learning through failure what you're not so good at. And what do I mean by failure, learning, teaching you what you're not good at? I mean, you might think you're good at something. You might say, I'm good at sales. Okay, I'll take the opposite tack here. I'm good at sales. And then you find that, while you're good at sales, your partner is much better than you. And so if your definition of learning your language is working at the thing you're exceptional at, which means better at than most people around you, you might learn that he or she should be doing the selling and you should be adding value in a different way, right? Conversely, you might learn that you thought you were great at designing products. In fact, you're better at selling products or telling the story of a product, but someone else is better at designing them. And you learn that typically through some kind of a failure or a setback. I thought I was good at this. I went out to do it. Turns out I'm not so good at it, but I'm good at this other thing.
Yes.
And you have to listen to failure. And so if you are living and learning your language, the first habit, and if you are using failure as a constant refinement tool, then this leads you to the third habit, which is upgrading your network. And when I had a chance to interview Russell Simmons, who's a great entrepreneur, he had this great phrase which has stuck with me forever, which is good givers are great getters. That if you're going to build a network, you have to be willing to give a lot in order to get a lot back. And I know, Ash, I'm sure you have been around a lot of networks, and I have been too, where people only come into the network when they want something.
Yes.
And they ask for it, and it's reasonable for them to ask for it. The problem is they haven't been giving the whole time. And so when they make the ask, everyone kind of, they get crickets. They don't get much back.
Exactly.
Because they haven't been giving. Good givers are great getters.
Yeah, you have to cultivate the land before you harvest it. So
exactly. People come to me all the time looking for advice on raising funds. I say, I can teach you how to raise money for your business 3 years from now. I can't teach you how to raise it in the next 3 months, because what you have to do for 2.5 years is give and give and give. And then the last 6 months you can ask.
Yes.
Right. So upgrade your network. So I asked this one question of people, and it's an interesting question. Is it essential to know people who know people? And I wonder for the folks watching this right now, if they're wondering, why is that such an important question? In networking, the most commonly believed strengths of networks of successful people are that they know a lot of people and that they know the right people. And it turns out that those two are not important to self-made millionaires. What's important is knowing people who know people. It's a very different characterization. And in that very simple sentence, I'm going to teach you about a form of networking that explains a tremendous amount of the success of the people that we admire. So again, this is a thinking moment to activate that brain, because what I'd love you to do on your own time is write down the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 people who make up your inner business network, your go-to people that you seek advice from and you seek, wisdom, and that you share your failures with. Who are those people? Write down their names, know who they are, because we're going to talk about them now. So when I asked this question, is it essential to know people who know people? How many of my respondents said yes? Very obvious data here, right? From the middle class, half of them saying that's important, all the way up to almost all, 96% of the ultra high net worth saying it is essential to know people who know people. What they're telling you is they're debunking the myth that you have to know the right people and you have to know a lot of people. Neither of those are true. What you have to do is know people who know people. And let me just unpack this statement now, because if you've been networking your whole life and you don't know what this means, I understand. But very successful people, without ever being taught this in any kind of a school, both know this and live this.
It's the difference between like a branch and a tree. So it's a whole shift.
You got it.
Yeah.
So there's you at the center of your network. This is the fancy term for this is called nodal networking, but you just described it very, very well. Yes. It's you in the center of a network with about 5 people who form up your nodal network. These are 5 people that you really invest in, 5 people that you've gotten to know. Not surprisingly, the 5 people you share your failures with frequently and then ask them for wisdom, and then you invite them to do the same with you. And those 5 people are doing the same thing as you are. they're practicing nodal networking of their own. And those 5 people or those 25 people are practicing nodal networking of their own. This is a network of people who know people. That's what it looks like. And it's in full bloom. And if you want to know why the successful people you know are moving to communities with other successful people, it's because without ever knowing the words nodal networking, they are practicing this exact form of networking, which is a full-bloomed network based on nodes. But it comes back to, and your job is to find those about 5 people that you're really going to invest in, okay? And we call it business intimacy, which is always a very uncomfortable topic. So I wonder, for those of us watching and listening right now, when you were asked to write down your go-to network, the people you share with frequently, I wonder if some of you came up with none or 1.
Right.
And you're asking yourself, gee, I don't seem to know a lot of people. Or maybe you came up with 10 or 15 or 20, and then I'll ask you, okay, so you know 10 or 15 people, but what kind of intimacy, what kind of connection can you possibly have with 15 people? And here's what I'll ask you as a gut check on those 15 people. Do you know how much money they make and how much they want to make? Because if I want to be really helpful to you, Ash, I want to know that you make $100,000 and your goal is to make $150,000 and that you need 3 more clients to get there. Because then I can be helpful to you.
That's a deeper level. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Much purposeful. Yeah.
And it's purposeful. And you should go to somebody and say, I want to be really connected to you. I want to share the kinds of things that maybe in our community we don't regularly share with each other.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
These are the kinds of questions that you want to, these are the kinds of levels that express intimacy. A lot of people say, I think in sales, they say, you should know the school they went to. You should know the charities they favor.
Yeah.
Yes, but that's not intimacy. That's just helping to create rapport.
Right, exactly. And that reminds me, because one of the key things we try to do with the Top 1% Sellers Academy is to help sellers who are in the top 20% really join the ranks of the very coveted top 1% sellers. And this reminds me of working in your business versus working on your business. And I think a lot of sellers, day-to-day, pace of work and how heavy they have to keep pursuing their quota, and their account teams, they forget that they have to really get very purposeful around what is the network that we're leveraging now, whether it's within their own company, the customer organization, the partner organization. And I think what you're saying here is you have to, on a regular basis, really take a look at that network and how valuable it is and how much intimate you are with that network.
Absolutely. And keep it small.
Yeah.
Keep it small. Because what we notice are that the question of the size of the network becomes very important.
Yes.
So there's 2 ways of looking at your network. There's the people in your network that you work with to get things done. So I'll tell you, we've all been around for a while. I can tell you that, how many times when somebody works in, let's say, corporate America, and you say, what do you do? And they'll say something like, I'm a vice president of sales. I've got 15 people reporting to me. Now look at what the ultra high net worth are telling us. They want the fewest number of people reporting to them. Yes. So where in some places we brag about how many people report to us, as levels of wealth go up, it gets smaller, but it gets more intimate. Those people become much more trusted lieutenants, but they have to be fewer of them because true intimacy is very hard to have for 15 people. It just doesn't work.
Exactly, yeah.
And then you talk about full-on sales. How many people do you network with to get more business? Again, the middle class seem to misunderstand the power of nodal networking. Remember that number 5 I shared with you?
Exactly, yeah.
It's networking with people who know people. You don't need to have a lot of people in your network. You have to have the right people in your network who know people who practice nodal networking.
Yes.
And that's that critical number.
Absolutely. And I can see for an account manager just listening to this thinking, oh my goodness, usually when I'm running a very large account, there are so many players. And my thought is that he or she would need to divide and conquer and leverage the account team to have their own 2 to 3 very valuable, deep relationships on the account versus the main account manager trying to basically be very good at all of the relationships, right?
Right. Because of business intimacy, because business intimacy is a tricky thing to get to. There's chemistry, there's alignment. This is like finding a spouse. I mean, this is like finding best friends. It's not easy, but I can tell you for sure that the most successful people I've ever interviewed have a few people that they speak to, sometimes a few times a day. Not occasionally, but a lot.
Absolutely.
So upgrading your network is an essential skill, and there's two things that that fit underneath upgrading your network. That's called luck and magic, and I want to break them down for you now because I think this is kind of fun and sexy. And I'll just remind everyone that I think we worked out, Ash, that you're going to share some bit of the book, The First Habit, which kicks off all three of these habits.
Yes.
With your community. So, okay, so luck. Luck is what I think of as a fancy word for the fancy word that describes it is transitivity. And so what does transitivity mean? Well, so we've got networks right now, and some of those networks are made up of people who need each other and know each other. For example, let's say you're in the trucking industry, okay? And you go to the annual trucking convention, and that's a very important place to be. But the reality is, while those people in that industry need each other, they all know each other. It's not so easy to create luck for yourself when you're one of 20 other trucking companies that show up at the trucking convention. Yeah. There's good education, don't get me wrong, but there's not a lot of luck to be created in that room. Then you've got other networks where, let's just say you're in a public place like the airport, where you don't know if you need each other and you don't know each other. Also very hard to create business luck in an airport or in some large public place.
Absolutely.
Now take don't need each other but know each other, which would be like, I joke, this is about your friends from high school. Basically, you know each other, but you don't really need each other. I don't mean you don't emotionally need each other. I mean, right. You don't create a lot of business opportunity when 10 of your best friends all know each other and they all know everything about each other, and there's not much luck to be created in that environment.
Yes.
There's really only one configuration that creates luck, which is the fundamental permutation of a nodal network, which is when you need each other and don't know each other. You see, the beauty of a network of people who know people, like that full-bloomed butterfly, yes, is that there's a lot of activity taking place of people who need each other, but they don't always know each other. But if you've got real business intimacy with the 5 people in your core network, and they're practicing nodal networking themselves, and when someone says, hey, I've got this problem, and then they share it with somebody, and because there's enough sharing going on at the business intimacy level, they'll say, oh, you should send it to this other person who knows a person whose name is Ash, and he actually has a need for that. Yes. And that's when everyone comes back to that lucky moment when you say, how'd you get that job? How'd you get that account? How'd you get that opportunity? It's always, Ash called me. He called me to tell me about it. It's always a person who introduces you to that opportunity. Exactly. That's the nodal network. So a network of people who need each other and don't know each other. And so as complicated as all this might sound to you, really what you have to do, which sounds easy but is actually hard, if in the age of social media, we're all supposed to have 500 and 5,000 connections, is actually find 5 people, just 5 people, and just have a strong, intimate business connection to them. That's how luck comes your way. And just be sure that those 5 people understand that they've got to be building their own nodal networks too, not just relying on yours, but building out. So the magic part of this, which I love, is what you mentioned earlier. It's social contagion. It's just, we all know what contagion is. So there's that full blooming network again of nodal network. And what's contagion? Somebody who's got a cold, without ever knowing the other person, passes the germs on to somebody else, okay? Because they both held the same pole in the bus, and the next thing you know, through contagion, this other person is sick. And social contagion works exactly the same way. So we've got this person who went through one of my programs named Darren Janelle, and he found great success in it. And then we've got someone else who I get a chance to work with a lot. Her name is Leanna Ling, and she experienced greater success. And when we talked about why she was having this renewed success, it had a lot to do with the fact that she was connected to a person who was connected to a person who was connected to Darren. These are what successful networks look like. It's like any other contagion. It's actually magic. And the reason I call it magic is we can't see it happening, but it's working for us. That's what magic is. And so the magic of putting yourself in a network of people who have the same 3 habits in mind, the same success orientation, proves itself out in a form of contagion or magic. You just can't see it working. And it's true in negative and positive ways. There's a ton of data. You want to quit smoking? Don't hang out with people who smoke. You want to lose weight? Hang out with people who go to the gym. You know, if you try to break this, if you try to be the one person quitting smoking while everyone around you still smokes, it's a much higher failure rate. The reverse is true. You want to be successful? Hang out with people who want to be successful too.
Makes a lot of sense.
So now imagine pulling together a network where luck and magic are working for you. It's what I call the ultimate success network. And so imagine, for example, what Darren put together. So Darren has me, on his nodal network because he and I work together. And he's got Leanna Ling by extension on his network. And what I do through my properties, my project, is I bring some other folks to the table, people that you may or may not have ever met. This is Tony Hsieh from Zappos. His success is palpable. His methodology, his philosophy is very much available for people to learn through our system. Russell Simmons, I mentioned earlier. So your network can ultimately be this sort of blooming network where you're practicing social contagion by putting yourself in the middle of a success network or where luck and magic come together, all by understanding the underpinnings of what a success network looks like, right?
Absolutely.
And I always encourage people to imagine what their lives would be like if they were in the center of this network, and again, now that nothing's stopping you. This is not about technology. This is not about, some expensive program. This is just about executing on this three-step philosophy.
Yeah.
And so what I do with people, Ash, is, forget all that other stuff, just start small.
Yes.
Is I work with something called immersive mentoring, where essentially you can learn from people like Tony Hsieh or Russell Simmons just by being around their success philosophy, just by exposing yourself to the way they do it. And if you could imagine, if you can fast forward when you've spent time with the Tony Hsiehs of the world, and you've learned how they approach decision-making and team building and risk, and just had a chance to hear how they do it, what would your life be like? And so think about who you are today. You're not focused, you're afraid of failure, and you're not spending time with the right people. And imagine going through this rewiring process, which really looks at all these different areas of our lives that are hampered by the way we've grown up, and think about what it would be like to be focused on one thing or two things. Yes. And be able to make decisions, because failure is not a bad thing, and building a network where luck actually does find you. Imagine how amazing that would be. And then fast forward, right? Imagine where all this stuff has been working for a while.
Exactly.
You have figured out, you've proven yourself that you have what it takes to succeed, and that all the sacrifice you've put into the work you've done is worth it. And ultimately, you are part of a business that everyone knows about. Because when we talk about successful people we admire, Ash, this is how they live their lives. That's what they have. And I don't see any reason why any one of us who's watching this now or thinking about how success can find them can't accomplish all this, as long as they follow these three habits, and as long as they honor the fact that they have to learn how to practice these three habits from people who have done it already, and maybe pay a little less attention to the parents whispering in our ear, or the old school teachers, and in many instances, even our bosses, who are teaching us a way of creating wealth and success that just doesn't kind of tie into the way the world is now.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I think, to your point, then the first thing people have to do is really catch those thought processes, really know what the source is, how far back it is, or maybe, to your point, maybe it's a conversation with your current manager that you may not be getting the right guidance. And the concept of immersive mentoring, whether they do that through working with you, Lewis, or other sources, at least they know specifically what needs to happen as a result, and really rebuild their network, rebuild their thought process.
Right. And the easiest way to do that, by far, is to be around people who've done it. It's just the easiest. It's magic. Yeah. And so, a lot of people with mentoring, here's what they do. They say, can I sit with you, Ash, or can I sit with you, Lewis, and tell you all the things going on in my life? And I appreciate that. But you know what works better? Hang around with really successful people, and you'll find that they give you the answers without you even asking the questions, because they're living it, they're breathing it, they're acting on it. So if I put someone together with Tony Hsieh in person, and that person says, I run a real estate company, and I don't seem to be getting the kind of traction I'm looking for. Better be this. Just watch Tony do what he does. Just pay attention. You'll see how he operates and how he thinks, and you'll see through osmosis that you start operating that way too.
Absolutely. And as you and I talked, Lewis, earlier on when we tried to plan this up, and when you take a look at sales professionals, most of them are essentially like franchise owners. They run their own book of business. And I love you to talk about, you work with a lot of entrepreneurs and business owners, as we said in the introduction. And as you think about that sales professional as a franchise owner, having to actually help others do exactly what we just talked about today, that they have to flip and be the person that sort of guides that.
Mhm.
What else can you tell that sales account manager to bear in mind their own self-management and direction, and then the people around them?
Well, I think that this is maybe a conversation that we could also move into at another time, but I think that there is a portion of sales that the best salespeople are really good at, and that there's about a half a dozen other things salespeople have to do that they're not particularly good at. And I think, just as simple as saying, here's what's great about being an entrepreneur. You can say, because I'm really good at this, I'm going to hire people to do all that other stuff.
Yes.
When you're in any level of employment, you have a harder time saying that. However, salespeople have, as we all know, have the most, influence at the companies they work for if they're delivering.
That's correct. Yes.
So they can go to their boss and they can say, let me focus more on this and help support me with these other things I'm not so good at. I think that that's a realistic conversation.
Yes.
And I think if you work for someone who says, no, I want you to do the 10 things you're not good at and get better at them so you can do that 11th thing you're good at, I would think you'd want to work somewhere else, but that's my opinion.
Right.
But the beauty of being an owner of a company is that at some level, what you have to do is inflicted upon you. After all, as the owner of a company, you have to make sure all the taxes get paid. That's something none of us like to do, but as owners, we have to make sure it happens.
Yes.
We have to fire people. None of us like to do that, but that's something you have to make sure happens. But I also get to say, you know what? I'm going to get help doing a bunch of things I don't like doing so that I could focus on the thing I do like doing. And I think that to your question, how do they bring this to the salesperson level, is to adopt that methodology. Let me figure out what I'm good at. Let me spend more time doing it. And let me find other people who are really good at all the other parts I'm not good at, and let the success speak for itself.
Exactly. And I think a lot of the time, like I've seen at Cisco and Oracle, a lot of these account managers actually are managing a team that's sometimes, 15 people strong. And they have to really be very conscious about how can I put the right resource on the right task and focus area for the accounts. I think you just now raised their level of understanding. How do I even effectively make use of each person on that account team? And then when it comes to networking and relationships, they have to get very close and intimate, and it's not a broad brush around rapport as they typically would think of it.
I agree. Yeah, exactly. And salespeople are much, much, much more empowered to do this than, let's say, a person who's got a more of a expense side of the shop. If you're the person who spends money for the company, it's a lot harder to go to your boss and say, let me spend money in a way that's better for me. But if you're the person who says, I generate revenue for the company, I think it's a lot easier to say, let me help generate revenue in a way that works best for me.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's talk a little bit about how do you, if you can talk about your own world a little bit, Lewis, who do you work with, in what shape and form? And then in addition to your books, do you have online content that people can perhaps consume? If you can maybe talk to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, and I'm very excited about something we're doing now. And if any of your viewers want to talk more about it, I'm happy to. And you can give them my email address. But I work very closely with the owners of fast-growing companies. So that's a person, I'll just give you a kind of a profile. Let's say it's a $10 million revenue company. Let's say the company is growing at 25 to 50% a year. So that company is doubling in size every 3 years, okay? Which means if they have 20 people, they have 40 people within 3 years. If they work out of a piece of real estate, they rent an office that's 2,000 square feet, they've outgrown it within 18 months of signing the lease. I mean, there's so much going on in these companies, right?
Exactly.
So I have a lot of experience in helping people keep those companies, the wheels on the wagon, and also to translate their early success into something that levels off into something that's much more sustainable.
Yes.
And so I work with companies anywhere from 2 million in revenue to about 150 million in revenue, and try to make sure that, think of it like a body at the gym. If you meet someone who's just working on their shoulders, I'm the kind of guy who says, let's work on the arms, the stomach, the core, the legs. Let's make sure the whole company works well so that you're not just reliant on one strength, because any one of those strengths can falter at some point. Then the second thing I do is I'm increasingly working with salespeople to teach them a very particular discipline. I'm really excited about it. It's called sales amplification. And the reason I learned it is because the number one challenge of most business owners is driving revenue.
Exactly.
And I kind of became aware of some of the techniques that are being used by very big companies, maybe the kinds of companies that your community works for, but that leverage artificial intelligence and big data. And, we're at this wonderful moment right now where the kinds of companies I've worked with forever are now able to leverage artificial intelligence and big data to help them with sales. And so I teach sales amplification. So I teach sales amplification to salespeople. I teach sales amplification to business owners. And I have a program called The Birthing of Giants that I teach to business owners that you have to apply to be in. And it's an exclusive school.
That's fantastic. I'm glad that we were able to cover that, because I think, a lot of people are doubling up. They have other businesses, or they may, to your point about networks, they may know someone that really needs what we just talked about. This is fantastic. I'm glad we got to really kind of get the nuggets from a lot of your research, Lewis, and I'm sure the audience and a lot of people who join the Top 1% Sellers Academy over the long term would benefit greatly from this conversation we just had. And I'll definitely be sharing a lot of that also with people over time. I want to thank you so much for joining me. I know it took us a while to get here, and I'm glad we're here, and I'm glad we were able to cover this amazing content. Thank you so much, Lewis.
Thanks, Ash. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Well, goodbye, everyone. Please do join us in our next webinar coming up actually on the 2nd of November with Ty Bennett, where we will be talking about storytelling specifically for sales professionals, and we'll basically be leveraging Ty Bennett's experience working with sales professionals across industries and really leveraging how do you implement storytelling in your messaging so that you're able to communicate your value proposition very effectively across business units and across lines of business where your solution will be used. So I definitely look forward to sharing with you that conversation. Stay connected with us on Twitter and Facebook as well as LinkedIn. We will be sharing a lot of information on these upcoming webinars. And then also check the page on the Top 1% Sellers webinar as a whole, the different features where we would be having like the hotline, the hot seats, and the coaching opportunities. And we look forward to you joining this community and really thriving and building your business even more as a sales professional and eventually really becoming a top 1% seller as well. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the Top 1% Sellers podcast. Give us your suggestions and guest recommendations by emailing us at ash@connectwithash.com. Thank you also for sharing this podcast with your colleagues and social media contacts. To connect with us on LinkedIn, please send a connect request to ash@connectwithash.com. See you at our next episode. Thanks for tuning in.